I'll make a start. So I was invited today to come and give a talk to you about new and recent work that's been taking place in the Highlands region. So what I thought I'd do is have a quick overview about previous studies, pretty brief overview really, and then look at new and current studies, so things that are happening around the Highlands region. And my focus is going to be on paleo-environmental studies, so I'm really just talking about things like pollen analysis, things like plant remains, things like charcoal. I'm not talking about things like faunal bone or thin section work, that sort of things. So just studies that are within the kind of realm of work that I do myself.
Scott, just to say that we can see, it might be worth maximizing your screen because we can see the slide that you're showing us and the next slide coming up.
Hang on, it's hang on, I know what's happened here. So
maybe you can't change that.
I need to share the other screen, I think. How about that now?
Yeah, better.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, so the outline of the talk then will be a brief overview of previous studies, new and current studies in the sort of field that I'm involved in, and then future direction. So I thought I'd kind of have a think about what work's kind of coming up and what kind of themes are coming up, and a lot of this is based on my own study and my own kind of thoughts on future research that I'm going to be doing myself. And then also I thought I'd put in something about guidance and collaboration based on the work that I've been doing with groups such as Tarradale and such as We Digs, and maybe things of interest, you know, for community archaeology as a whole. It's fair to say that not all of this is my own research, so I'm going to be presenting other people's research as well. I know more about my own research sites than I do about theirs, so I'll try and give an overview of what they're doing. But for anything detailed, we might need to contact the people who are actually doing the research, but again, I'll try and answer questions on those as well. So I thought I'd kick off really, we just kind of give an overview of what's gone on before in the region. And this is slides that I put together for a half talk that I gave a couple of years ago now, just as they were getting into the Highland archaeological research framework. And it's good to kind of stop and kind of think about what's occurred before. So there's been a lot of work in the Highlands region, and that's mainly as a result of having quite a lot of palynologists based in Scotland for a lot of years. So people like Richard Tipping, people like Kevin Edwards as well, Keith Bennett. There's been a lot of work that's gone on over quite a few years. And Richard produced a paper in 1994 that was in Proceedings Society of Antiquaries of Scotland on the form and fate of Scotland's woodland. And within that, he reviewed pollen diagrams from across Scotland, quite a massive piece of work to undertake, really. And this is just a part of that map that he produced to show what pollen studies had taken place pre-1994 in the region, and also whittling it down to those pollen studies that had accurate carbon dates. So radiocarbon dating came in the 1950s, but it wasn't sort of regularly used in pollen studies probably until the 1970s into the 1980s. So there's a lot of palynological work that's previously gone on within Scotland and within the Highland region, where we've got pollen profiles, we have vegetation information in terms of what that landscape was looking like generally, but we don't have radiocarbon dates for these to say exactly when those vegetation changes were taking place. So in a lot of these previous pollen studies, the way in which the dating was undertaken was by comparison through other diagrams to look at things like the fall in elm pollen to suggest that's when the Neolithic began and the end of the Mesolithic period. Things like the alder rise, things like the pine decline as well, around about 2000 BC. And so through comparing those main vegetation events, you're able to get a sense of the timescale of these. So there's more diagrams than this, but these are the ones that have got the C14 dates, so we know exactly when they were dated. And of course now radiocarbon dating, very familiar to everybody and very much standard practice for any archaeology and for getting pollen cores. You wouldn't be able to publish any sort of paleontological study now without having radiocarbon dates and a very good age depth diagram to be able to show exactly what date you're talking about for these vegetation changes. Since 1994, there has been more work in the region, but I'd say that you know, the 80s were and the 90s were pretty much the peak in terms of paleontological studies across the region and across Scotland. Since then, there's been a greater pull away probably from Scotland, even by the sort of institutes that are based in Scotland, based within the region, to do work outside of the region, outside of Scotland as a whole, as it was seen, you know, more progressive for things like the Research Excellence Framework to be doing work from across Europe, and it seems to have a greater sort of glamour attached to it than maybe doing a lot of work in your own backyard. But even so, you'll see on the map here that with those new studies, there's still quite significant gaps within the area, and this is by no means probably all the pollen studies. This is, you know, just a few that I was able to find in previously researching for the talk. So there's still areas around. I mean, for example, Inverness, as you'll see down there, there isn't really a very good pollen study for Inverness in terms of looking at vegetation change. And if you think about, you know, how much archaeology there is there, then, you know, it's particularly one is particularly needed, although it might be tricky in those areas because it's highly developed now as well. There's also been a lot of plant macrofossil studies, and so here I'm talking about charred plant remains and waterlogged plant remains. So charred plant remains, of course, are pretty much standard now on any archaeological excavation. You'll all have taken samples from sites for charred plant remains analysis or assessment, and this is looking at things like charred cereal grain to see what crops people are growing, but also the rudels, the weed taxa around these studies to see what agricultural methods were taking place. So is there any evidence, for example, of manuring? Is there any evidence for drainage? Is there any evidence for tillage? You know, getting a sense really of how that changes, and also changes in cereals over time. So is the Neolithic very different to the Bronze Age? Is the Bronze Age very different to the Iron Age, etc., in terms of what people are growing and how they're growing and the scale in which they're growing it on? And also included within charred plant remains often is charcoal, done to some extent. Largely charcoal has been used for radiocarbon dates, so often you get asked to do an identification for radiocarbon and then very little afterwards a lot of the time, which is quite a shame because you can get a lot of information from charcoal, as we'll be talking about within this talk. But also it can give you an idea, again, of fuel wood use, but you can tie that back into the pollen, because if you know what wood people are burning, what they're using for construction materials, then you get a sense of what the local woodland would have been like, and you can tie that back to the regional pollen signal to see if those trees are growing within that area itself. And charcoal's very good complementary data source for pollen, because often in charcoal you'll get down to some of the trees that don't produce very much pollen or are insect pollinated, and you can find out if they're more prolific in the environment than previously seen. So things like cherry trees, for example, don't produce a lot of pollen. Hawthorn trees don't produce a lot of pollen, but you can often find a good signal for these trees from the charcoal record. There's also been waterlogged plant remain studies around. These are largely not done on archaeological sites, and mainly that's because a lot of archaeological sites don't have waterlogged conditions. If you're on a dryland site, it's very rare that you'll get these. In urban areas, you tend to get them more so in, thinking about the old town of Edinburgh. There's often a fair bit of waterlogged plant remains done from there, where you've got drains, where you've got cesspits, etc. And where you've got maybe peaty or organic build-ups, then you can also do waterlogged plant remains. Within the context of this map that I'm showing you, a lot of the waterlogged plant remains were done alongside pollen in terms of looking at vegetation change. So with pollen, you are getting a kind of feel for what the landscape was like in terms of the regional vegetation, and indeed, depending on your pollen catchment zone, some of the local vegetation remains the seeds. They don't travel as far as the pollen grains, so they can tell you what's going on, right on your site. So that's really interesting and very relevant to look at in terms of finding out what changed locally. And this can relate back to woodland floor layers. It can relate back to heath buildup, but it can also relate back to mosses, for example, and looking at those as a way of looking to see a climate change through periods where you get more of the wet sphagnum mosses and more of the sort of drier hummocky mosses. So you can look at those over time and see how climate might have changed. So within all of these kind of studies that have happened before, we can have a stab at suggesting what the main research questions have been for the area. And you can see, a lot of the pollen was based on vegetational change. So particularly early pollen studies, they were very much about the botanical aspects of vegetational change and not so much in terms of anthropogenic change. Like looking at pollen for anthropogenic signals, we're very lucky in Scotland that you've got the forerunners of this kind of study in people like Kevin Edwards, in people like Richard Tipping, who have done tremendous work all the way through the region. But before this, papers like by Dunroe, etc., you're really looking at vegetation change. So looking to see how that's changed over time, thinking about what the main drivers for vegetational change are across these pollen studies. So was it climate change? Was it hydrological changes? Was it people in the landscape? A lot of these are also looking at things like tree migration. So when did trees return to the area after the last ice age? Is there any chance that there's relic woodland from that period? Refugia of woodland, for example. Then looking to see how woodland established itself. So what's the kind of vegetational succession of those woodlands, and when does it reach that kind of peak primeval woodland across the area? And then what happens to it afterwards, so the demise of that woodland. And in particular, as I mentioned before, things like the elm and pine decline are very good kind of markers within a vegetational record to look for when these occurred, although it's been shown now that the elm decline wasn't one synchronous event, and sometimes you get staggered declines, same for pine. And again, coming back to these are mainly sort of vegetational changes, but they do have implications in terms of, what's the impact of people in the landscape during this period, and did they help to exacerbate some of these changes that might have been caused, in the case of elm, by disease, and pine in terms of temperature as well. We're also looking for anthropogenic activity. So a lot of studies, particularly around child plant remains, are looking for the beginnings of agriculture. So thinking, when did the Neolithic begin in the Highlands region? And what signals do we have for that in terms of agriculture? What agricultural activity have we got through prehistory, through the medieval period, through into post-medieval period? And what changes are we seeing in that agriculture? And I don't think there's probably been too many syntheses of looking at agricultural change right from the Neolithic through to, say, the post-medieval period in an area, in a region, for example, and that could be an output from the regional research framework. Woodland clearance as well. So once we've established that woodland clearance has happened in things like pollen, we can start to look at that in terms of how it's been induced. So did people clear that landscape, or has it been through storm activity, through climate change, etc., and people then made use of those clearances? And of course, woodland clearance doesn't just happen. So often you get woodland clearance, then you get regeneration, then you get clearance, then you get regeneration, and then eventually maybe more open landscapes. But of course, in some areas where we have ancient woodland, it'd be quite interesting to see, how long that ancient woodland has been there for. Of course, we can only go back to the map evidence in terms of having a particular presence of that woodland in the landscape, but with things like pollen, we can take that back even further. Diet and economy on site. So again, thinking about what people were growing, when they were growing it, how that changed over time, but also what wild foodstuffs were people utilising. So in the Neolithic, we often see a lot of hazelnut use, as we do in the Mesolithic. But by the time we get to the Iron Age, that signal seems to go, and people are more dependent on the things that they're growing themselves. So we often see a fall off in the Bronze Age for gathered plants, but we might also pick out things that we use for medicinal purposes as well, and other useful plants that might come through too. Wood, thinking about charcoal analysis from sites. So what wood people are selecting from that environment? Is it selected because it's local, or have people targeted a specific tree type? And potentially we could then look at that in terms of woodland management. That hasn't been done very much so far in the region, but again, could be a useful research direction. Palaeoecology and conservation there's been a few studies on this now in the Highlands region, and in a way the Highlands region is kind of leading the way in this type of study. And that's because you have people like Richard Tipping, Althea Davies, Melanie Smith acting in the region and producing papers on this, and looking at the way in which modern ecological issues such as conservation of woodland, such as peatland restoration, how we can look at paleoecological records and get an idea for long-term changes and compare those to some of the sort of short-term changes that are happening, and maybe use that as future prediction models in order to see which direction planted woodland might go into in the future. There's also been quite a few paleoclimate studies in the area. So again, thinking about those waterlogged plant remains, people have looked at sphagnum to again look for wet-dry shifts. There's been some work on non-pollen palynomorphs within this, but again, that could be a future direction. And of course, there's been tephra studies from around the landscape since the 90s, and work with Dan Charman here, amongst others, to look at if we can get volcanic signals within the peatlands. Not only does that provide a brilliant dating horizon for any kind of paleoecological studies, but also it just shows you the extent to which the volcanic ash has spread across the region. And also, interesting when some tephra are picked up and others aren't picked up. So, what's happened to minimize that signal in others. So you can see the kind of new and current work that we're going to be picking up today really is in a background of quite established work done for the area. And just on the right there's Hilary Burke's map of pine stumps across the area. And there's been a fair bit of work that's been done mainly by Hilary on looking at pine stumps. There's a great paper in 1975 and some other papers in terms of where they are located, and they're pretty much all across the Highlands region. And they're even now, it doesn't show any on the Western Isles, but you can find pine stumps in the Western Isles as well, particularly in Harris area, and now we found some in Benbecula as well. So, all these kind of fossilized pine stumps, we can have a look at those in terms of former woodland, and there's a paper by Richard Tipping and Althea Davies et al. In 2009 on this as well at Farleigh. So again, it's something that's started in this region and is still being worked on today. So, the region does lead the way in quite a few areas here, and hopefully this will give you a flavour for the broad breadth of paleoecological work that's been done across the area. And of course, there's others in terms of faunal bone, human bone, etc. As well. So I thought now I'd just kind of talk about what's happening across the area. So some of these projects you'll be aware of. Some of them might be new to you as well, I hope so. And I'll field questions on them, that's not a problem. So where are they located then? So this is pretty much a map of the sites that I'm going to talk about today. These are studies that are either happening right now, or studies that are just beginning to happen, or studies that are pretty much set in the immediate future to begin. So again, you can see there's quite a broad area for sites that are being looked at here, and there's potential to be looking in other areas too. So I thought I'd start with some work that's on that theme of paleoecology and conservation. So a couple of studies that have taken place on this. One is my PhD student, Jasmine Seibenger, who is just writing up now, so she'll be finished hopefully in the next month or so, ready for a viva. And she's been looking at 3 sites in the Highlands region, So been looking at these sites, 1, 2, 3. So 2 in Caithness and 1 in Sutherland. And here we've been looking at long-term pollen records in peats that are up to, I think, 7 meters deep in places. And what we've been looking at here really is working with the Forestry Commission of Scotland, who have funded a lot of this work to see what the native woodland was like in these areas. So we've been coring and we've been looking for peats that particularly have wood fragments in them, as that's very much a very local signal for on that site. And what we've been doing here is we've been trying to cross-match some of the pollen evidence that Jasmine's been finding for these woodlands, looking to see how they demise. So was it reduced to people? Was it climate change, etc.? And matching some of this as we can to some of the ancient woodlands. So there's a really good ancient woodland survey that's been done across Scotland by the Forestry Commission, and you can get it. They've got maps that are regional. See the types of woodland that are present in all across the region. And one of the woodland types that are present is this upland birch pine woodland, and that's pretty much what we're getting through quite a lot of the places that Jasmine's been looking at. And the idea with this study really is then to feed this information back to the Forestry Commission, who might choose to replant at least part of this woodland in areas that are currently forested with these coniferous monoplantations. So there's 2 choices. They've been doing some excellent work in terms of re-establishing peat bogs throughout Caithness in the flow country, but it also gives them an option as to whether they might want to look at reproducing some of the original native woodland. So some of the work we're also doing is looking at future climate models and thinking about which trees within those woodlands would be able to grow and which ones might not be able to grow. So, you know, the feasibility really of bringing back native woodlands. And this kind of looking at paleoecology in terms of then aiding woodland management and forest management. It's also something that Althea Davies has been doing a lot of as well. And she's been looking at a couple of sites which are given here. So there's one in northwest Sutherland and one in southeast Sutherland. And through looking at long-term pollen records, we're able to really identify how trees have responded to different climatic conditions, but also we can potentially identify how trees have responded and woodlands responded to the impact of humans as well in the landscape. So how quickly can trees recover if they've been cleared? How quickly can trees recover if there's been a significant climatic change or hydrological changes as well? So this is again work that Althea has been picking up. We're also in the history of ancient deciduous woodlands. So again, thinking about these ancient woodlands that are on maps and thinking about how old they are, we can test this by doing pollen studies through small hollows, hopefully of kind of peat or organic sediments within these woodlands. So we're going to get a very local signal from these hollows, and that should give us an indication of how far these woodlands go back. So there's a PhD student just starting at the University of Aberdeen called Annabelle Everard, and she's really just beginning. So she's choosing sites. She's going to be looking at sites, hopefully we're thinking about over on the west coast, and then a site in Ireland and potentially a site in Orkney as well at the minute. It's totally up to Annabelle which site she chooses. But again, it's going to be looking at woodlands and woodland changes. So a lot of the woodlands that we see that are on these maps, these ancient woodlands, are often called semi-ancient woodlands. And that's because they sometimes have invasive species in them, or we think they've been modified. I mean, all these woodlands will have been modified by people to some extent. So by going back through the sediment record at these sites, we should be able to see how these woodlands have changed. And we're looking for ancient woodland indicators such as wood anemone, for example. So a lot of these ancient woodland indicators are plants that only sort of come into these woodlands after the woodlands existed for a period of 100 years, say, and therefore you've got some evidence that it's a long established woodland to get these plants, these pollen indicators within there. So we're going to be looking at pollen. We're also going to be looking at plant macrofossils and wood identifications, and also to see how people are interacting with these woodlands over time, but also how animals interact with these woodlands over time as well. And I think the impact of grazing animals is often underplayed in pollen diagrams. It's becoming maybe more looked at now with the addition of dung fungi in counting pollen. So you often look for these dung indicators that tell you that animals are around. But you know, they can have quite an impact on areas, particularly if you think about deer and the impact they have on small saplings and woodland regeneration as well. So hopefully that's going to add to that kind of that kind of picture. We've also been doing some work with the We Digs community, and Anna's here, and looking at their sites. So after a long period of time, we took a core from around Acton, the location here, of a group of hut circles in this area, probably about 4 years ago now, maybe. And we've just got a master's student now, an MRes student, starting on this project with us at the University of the Highlands and Islands, but also in conjunction with Althea, who's just shown you, and Tim Marl at the University of Aberdeen as well. And again, working in collaboration with the We Digs group. So again, questions that we'll be looking at here, you'll see that they're kind of familiar in terms of some of the broad questions from previous research studies. But looking at kind of environmental changes in association with hut circle communities hasn't been done very much at all, really, in Scotland, and they may be underplayed slightly in terms of their archaeological importance. And Anna has been mapping about 500 of these along the west coast. So, you know, it could be the sort of every person's accommodation in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, but it suggests that, you know, quite significant communities of people were present in this landscape. So the reason why we want to look at this pollen core, this landscape, really, is that we want to see, you know, when did people really start coming into this area and having an impact? Was it during the Bronze Age? Was it maybe during the Iron Age? And what kind of impact were they having? You know, can we see woodland clearance? Can we see agricultural evidence? Can we see pastoral evidence in this landscape? And can we say anything about whether these hut circles were used seasonally, whether it's some transhumance going on, or maybe in the same way that sheilings were used in the post-medieval period, or were they more permanent and people were living in this landscape throughout the year? So we want to kind of look at this in fine detail through some of these pollen cores and get a handle on this. We also want to see what activities were taking place in the area. So whether people may have been managing a woodland resource around there. You know, the hut circles themselves would have needed wood for construction. You also need construction materials for other activities that might have taken place, funeral pyres, etc., in the landscape, and also metalworking activity. So if there is metalworking activity going on, again, you need fuel for kilns, etc. Is that managed to the extent? And can we find signals of metalworking through looking at paleopollution evidence? So the idea is that on the pollen core we've taken already, pollen counting has begun on that, and I can tell you it's very nice pollen. And there is quite a bit of woodland pollen within that, which matches some of the early work that I did in the cubianitin samples. We're just going to send off some samples now for radiocarbon dating to get our age depth together for this project, because the labs have been shut through COVID, but they're now open. And also we're hoping to take a second call for geochemical analysis. And in this way, we're going to be looking if we can find any signals of heavy metals, for example, so things like lead, things like copper, things like zinc. If there's any increases of those through the period of hut circle communities present in the landscape, then maybe we can get a trace of metalworking and maybe look to see how much of an impact that's having. And again, paleopollution work is something that's quite new to this region as well, or it will be. Myself, I've been doing some work at Culduthel, the big Iron Age village in Venetia. I finished off some of the archaeobotanical work last year, but there's still lots more to do. So this is something I want to quite get finished and do some work on. You can see from the picture there, if you're not aware of the site, there's some absolutely monumental roundhouses on the sites. You can fit whole people within some of the post holes on this. This is I think this is roundhouse 10, which was which went through 3 phases of architectural design, becoming more and more grand as it went. So starting off small, and then you can see the additional post holes and a porch area coming off it. There's also evidence of workshops on the site and lots of metalworking activity. So it's very much a metalworking place. And when we were looking at the child plant remains, we could see that there is quite a lot of cereal grain on the site, but there's very, very little evidence of processing, which suggests that people may be trading grain in exchange for metalworking goods. And there's also suggestions of trade from evidence of crops like spelt wheat on the site as well, which is more of a kind of Roman crop, Roman introduction. Wheat itself is pretty scarce across the site, and you can see that the majority of the grain is hulled barley. So phase 1 is Neolithic, and then phase 3 and phase 4 the Iron Age. You can see in the Neolithic, very much naked barley was the crop, and then you can see by the time it's the Iron Age, there's very little naked barley, and 6-row hull barley is made there. But it's also interesting because we do have evidence for oats on the site as well. So we get quite a good increase of oats, particularly in sort of phase 3 and phase 4. And oats do kind of come in towards the end of the Iron Age, sort of mid to late Iron Age, as one of the main crops that are grown on the site. So again, we're getting nice information in terms of agricultural change, agricultural activities. The site also had some barley that had sprouted, so there could be some beer making going on in Culduthel. I'm not sure drinking while metalworking is a good idea, but that may be why we've got so much charcoal and things that we can have a look at later through accidents. We've also been looking at some samples from Tarradale through time, so I've just been doing this recently with the idea to assess the samples really to see what's in them and get an idea of what future work can be done. So the sites that I looked at, particularly the Palaeoecology site, I hope that's right, and Gilchrist. So the Palaeoecology site had some really nice cereal grain in it from a pit that was pretty much stocked full of cereal grain. It was mainly hull barley, but you can see in the bottom here there's some hull barley, and we've also got some nice rachis fragments suggesting that there is crop processing. So there's also lots of nice charcoal. There's some really nice roundwood charcoals as well, which suggests that there could be evidence for woodland management going on in terms of procuring wood resources, maybe from the local woodland. We haven't identified the charcoal yet, so we know there's quite a lot of non-oak, but in terms of what it is, that is non-oak. And there is also quite a lot of oak charcoal. And what's quite interesting is amongst the child plant range of the sites, if this bottom one here, these are buds of oak. They're a bit elongated because of the way I put them on the on the slide here, but these are oak buds. So obviously woodland collection was happening in the spring at this place. So we've got some nice buds. We've also got birch buds on here as well from the site. And the agriculture, very much hull barley, but there's also quite a lot of oats here, and there's a smattering of emmer wheat as well. So it's just with the oats and the hull barley, then the earliest it could be is sort of middle to late Iron Age. But with the thing as a whole, there's quite a lot of ruderals, agricultural weeds that are very suggestive of sort of a medieval date. I'm not quite sure what date the site is supposed to be, so that's one. But there's things like wild radish, for example, which kind of appear mainly in sort of medieval sites. So there's some good potential here to do some nice work. The child grain is very nice, particularly from the pit, and the charcoal is good as well. So we're going to be identifying some of this now for radiocarbon dating, getting those dates back, and then seeing what we can do. There's also a nice peat monolith from the Palaeoecology site as well, and one of the monoliths that's taken us a nice bit of wood wedged into it as well, some wood. So that'd be nice to identify that and to maybe do some pollen on that as well. So it'd be interesting to take dates from that to see if they actually coincide with the on-site activity too. Not within the Highlands, but I thought I'd throw this in anyway. Some of the work from University of Aberdeen as part of the big Pictish Kingdoms project. Sam Jones, from a PhD student who, again, is just kind of coming to the end of her PhD now, has been doing work at Iona, and she's also been doing work at Rinnie and some of the areas where they've got known sort of power centres within the picture period. So the work on Iona really has been looking at that pictures period, but also, you know, so many sort of ecclesiastical connotations there, looking to see how the sort of monastic side of it was utilising the landscape as well. And there's pollen work that's been done from this site to show that there was a lot of arable and pastoral activity. So again, using pollen in a way to see what's going on in the landscape in terms of this agricultural activity. And also you can put in things like those dung fungi, as you can see here, to see if you've got more evidence of sort of pastoral indicators as opposed to arable by having cattle in the landscape, which you can identify through the dung fungi. And again, you've got evidence here of land change. So after the Common Monks, you can see there's a brief abandonment and a recovery of woodland. And this is the thing that, you know, you do get woodland regeneration. And in terms of thinking about how you can apply that to sort of modern ecology, you know, on these, because we've got these nice established age depth diagrams, we can see how long it took for woodland to recover, and we can see which species came in first, and then how that succession took place as well. There's some continuation of arable farming here, and then after that you get more intense pastoral farming. Again, and that could be by further ecclesiastical societies or maybe Norse settlers. So again, you know, you can see again also some loss and ignition changes and that going on as well. So again, we can look at these in terms of paleo-environmental evidence to really get a handle on how societies are interacting with their landscape. And the more kind of methodologies we throw at it, the better picture you're going to get. So in terms of paleo pollution, in terms of woodland clearance, in terms of agriculture, in terms of woodland management, etc. And the key thing is that a lot of the information that we're getting from these palaeoecological studies and from the archaeological sites, you know, they really can help to answer future questions as well, you know. So a lot of it is relevant, even if we may not be aware of how relevant it is. So that's kind of an overview of things that are happening. I'm going to try and build on this because I know there's more stuff happening. So I'm going to get in touch with some of the commercial units around the place, because their picture's kind of missing from this, and I know they're going to be doing some interesting work. So for the HAF conference talk, we'll be putting more of that in it. But I thought I'd kind of shift on now in terms of thinking about future directions and future work that's taking place. So one of the things that we've been doing is working with the Ecomuseum on Skye. And Dan Lee, our outreach officer, has been working with people like Angus at the Ecomuseum to think about ways in which we can help communities there to look at the landscape. So it's very much similar to work that you'll all be familiar with in terms of thinking about projects that can bring people together, but also produce new information on the area. And also within Skye itself, as you'll be aware, there's quite a few sort of honeypot sites that a lot of people flock to. So they have problems with a lot of tourists coming to these areas and sort of overusing areas. And it'd be nice to kind of redirect people to different places within that Ecomuseum area to go and have a look at more of the archaeology and experience more of the landscape as well. So we've been working there. We've done some coring out with people. This was a nice lowland bog, which is over 7 meters deep. So again, you can get a really nice signal from that. They've been doing some excavation. It's very much following in the footsteps of the Scotland's First Settlers project. Doing some landscape survey as well with people to kind of, you know, show them the different techniques that are used in archaeology. And Hannah, who's doing the Out of the Rounds project, the Wee Digs one, is going to go on placement with Skye Ecomuseum for a while to kind of help put together project ideas as well. So out of that, there might be projects that are coming out. We're particularly interested in things like the clearance villages. There's not a lot of post-medieval work being done over there. I'm obviously interested in peat bogs and maybe some of the any other sort of archaeobotanical evidence that comes out of these little excavations. But what we're hoping to do as part of this is to produce a kind of, you know, a list of project ideas, and then it's up to the Ecomuseum which ones they take forward, and up to the community themselves. And we're there really just to help facilitate and come up with ideas with themselves, and then, you know, aid on any future projects that come out of it. You'll probably be aware that Martin Carruthers has been up in Swartigill, or not so much this year, as all excavations have been cancelled, as I'm sure you're well aware. But we've got this Iron Age site that's been coming out exposed up here. We've got a building here. You can see they've identified at least 3 phases of building construction. Some of the earliest phases, you can see this hearth just emerging as they're getting through these digs. At the minute, they've only been kind of visiting the site for a couple of weeks a year, but they're hoping to extend excavations to at least 4 weeks, and maybe this could become another dig that we can get students helping with, as well as community members. There's been some nice finds coming up, including some Norse material as well. A nice blade sharpener there. And they have been taking samples, but we haven't really looked at anything yet. So again, this could be very much a future site to look at the archaeobotany and to look at the charcoal. And between this, the Cairns Broch project and Culduthel, we're going to start building a nice kind of slice of what different agricultural activities are taking place at these different kind of sites. And also woodland use, charcoal use, fuel use. It may not be charcoal, it could be very much turf burning, as we've seen at the Cairns Broch site, for example. So again, more information about how people are interacting with the landscape. And I've been thinking as well about my future research over the next 3 or 4 years, so what directions I'm going to go into. And I'm kind of sort of, doing this bit for myself, really, and kind of reflecting on where I'm going to go. But I think there are relevances to the studies that I'm in, the kind of directions and things that I'm interested in terms of where studies in the Highland research framework might go, but also in terms of, there might be elements of this that you're interested in, or your sites want this kind of information, and therefore, that's maybe things we could collaborate on. So one of my particular research interests is submerged landscapes, and I want to kind of continue this work. I've been looking at sites in Orkney and in the Western Isles, but we had a master student with us last year who tried to produce a map just looking at the west coast of Scotland and looking to see through literature reviews where there are intertidal peats. And this is by no means every site, but you can see there's a lot of sites obviously on the Western Isles, but there are sites around the west coast within the Highland region as well, and I'm sure there's lots more. This was very much a desk-based study, and I'm sure if there was somebody who could go out and speak to local communities and maybe do a bit of the survey, that would help show these. There have been obviously coastal zone assessment surveys, but it's hit and miss whether they actually mention peats within those. So they're very much kind of focused on archaeology exposed in these areas, and therefore maybe not so much interested in things like submerged forests and trees that are there, and looking at vegetation change, but also the impact of people in these areas. So this is some microscopic charcoal, and it has these little rectangles in it, and you can see it's just these little lines. This is stomata, and this is from reeds. So this is evidence of reed burning within these intertidal zones, which would have been freshwater areas in the Mesolithic and into the Neolithic. And of course, if you've got these dynamic areas and you've got people living around them, it's so much interesting to see what these communities are doing to respond to these changes. Are they moving away from areas? Are they moving to areas? The work we've been doing in Orkney, for example, suggests that people aren't moving away at all. And there's quite a lot of resilience in communities who are facing such dynamic landscape changes. And that's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of future study. Another thing I'm looking at is native woodland character. So with the work that Jasmine's doing, with the work that Annabelle's doing, for example, they all tie into this kind of overall arching research question, which is, how species rich were our native woodlands, and what diversity have we got? So because we've got so much peatland around, and because we do have evidence, even going back to Burke's study of those pine stumps, we've got evidence of woodland floors, and we can look at that in terms of vegetational evidence. And that's very important to do this in terms of pollen, but plant macrofossils. So in pollen, it's quite hard sometimes to get that kind of woodland floor reconstruction. You've got a lot of tree pollen, mainly if you're in something like a birch woodland, for example. The tree pollen can produce so much pollen that it masks some of the other signals. So you have to do things like concentration diagrams to really get into detail there to try and find these. But by doing the plant macrofossils as well, so things like nuts, nutlets, sedge nutlets, we can really look to reconstruct the ground floor there and see, where they're quite swampy, where they're quite open. These woodlands, if it's quite dense woodland, we wouldn't expect to have that much of a species-rich ground flora, but if it's quite open, then we might get quite rich ground flora. So how does that change through time? So I'm quite interested in looking at that in terms of native woodland and early to mid-Holocene woodlands in particular. And again, you can see how it ties in with submerged forests as well. One thing that hasn't been done a lot really in the Highlands, but could be, sure the evidence there, is looking at the cultural significance of woodland. So here I've been looking at funeral pyres and looking at the charcoal there to see, what wood was selected for funerals and whether it's lots of different woods, whether it's local wood or whether it's a specific type. Now, if you've got a landscape that's full of oak, you would probably pick out oak and use oak as the main funeral pyre because it burns high temperatures and it burns over a long period. But even when oak is in the landscape, as it is for this site here, which is based in Wales, you can see that the majority of wood used is alder and then one small bit of hazel. So it looks like people are specifically selecting alder as the prime pyre material. So thinking about the reasons behind why people select certain wood types for things like funeral pyres, it would be quite a nice direction. And you think about it, there's probably quite a lot of charcoal stored in museums, etc., around the Highlands region from such sites that hasn't really been looked at. As you can see here, we're looking at the actual ring curvature to suggest what part of the tree the charcoal's from. So again, if you look at a lot of the charcoal records so far from the Highlands region, you'll find the charcoal, you find the ID, and then you might have like grams in brackets, but it's not really getting to the point of were people felling trees, were people managing trees. And you can see here for this pyre that it's mainly branch wood that's been used. So this might represent maybe, the felling of a couple of alder trees, and you've got some of the trunk wood and then most of the branches. So it's not really having a massive impact, but people are deliberately selecting alder over other trees. So thinking about that and how people relate to their landscape is one direction. And then again, thinking of prehistoric agricultural practices. So this one I'm quite interested in sites like Culduthel, which I've been looking at, and also over the last few weeks I've been looking more at the Nessa Brodga as well, and thinking about how agricultural practices change through time. So, if you're digging a prehistoric site and you have got charred cereal grain, then that's all going to add to that overall picture. And again, this is the sort of work that's been done through excavation, and that's why bringing in some of the units, the information from the grey literature in particular, will be really valuable to the Highland framework, and thinking about the picture as a whole as to what evidence there is for agricultural shifts and changes through time. And have we got evidence of processing such as these wheat spikelets, these emerald wheat spikelets, and can we see changes in cereals over time, such as naked barley through to maybe hull barley, as we saw at Culduthel. And then lastly, prehistoric industry is one future direction. So again, this comes back to some of the work being done at WeDigs in terms of can we see paleo pollution records, but also again, looking at things like charcoal from sites such as metalworking sites at Culduthel, where we can see here, which this little charcoal fragment, he looks a bit like Groot with his kind of sad Groot here, but we can see quite clearly the strong curvature of the rings here, which suggests this is branch wood. And if we get a lot of branch wood in evidence of kilns, then we know people are probably coppicing the woodland or managing the woodland in some way to preserve that resource. So that, again, thinking about how people are acting sustainably within their landscape to preserve that wood resource rather than just completely felling it, or are they completely felling it? And we often see maybe in some of the burnt mound evidence that we look at that there is a lot of felling of woodland for fuel for burnt mounds. So again, burnt mounds have probably not been utilised as a big archaeological target in the Highlands as much as they could be. There's a lot of burnt mounds in the Highland region. They're mainly on a map. We mainly think, oh, it's a cooking place, let's ignore it. But they can offer quite a lot of information in terms of how people are interacting with that landscape and how they're utilising their local woodland resources as well. So there's quite a lot of work to be doing there. And I've got a new MRes starting in October who'll be looking at burnt mounds in Orkney and in Ireland. And then So that's kind of a view of the sort of research that I'm interested in, research that's going on in the region and the research that has gone on in the region. But I thought I'd kind of finish my talk really by just kind of thinking about what guidance and information is there out there for groups who are digging a lot of these sites. So things like Tarradale, for example, and things like the work you're all doing, and I'm sure you can feel free to disagree with me at the end of this, that's totally fine. But I was thinking about things like scientific advice. So what advice is there that's out there in terms of the sites you might be digging and the kind of questions you're interested in? So personally, I kind of feel that a lot of excavations are done in terms of working out what it was that was there, in terms of thinking about structural evidence, in terms of finds, and maybe things like the archaeobotany, the charcoal, etc. is kind of, you know, you want that. It's not always part of the research framework to begin with. And in terms of what information is out there, when we originally did the SCARF archaeological science panel, one of the outcomes that we were pushing really was for Historic Environment Scotland to think about getting a scientific advisor. And I just went to the Historic Environment Scotland page today thinking, you know, if I'm doing a dig, what information is there for me in terms of the scientific stuff, the archaeobotany, etc., the faunal bone, etc. And really, that's the page that comes up. And as you can see, it's not really there at all. And I know Lisa Brown is around, and she can talk to you about it. But you know, if you go to Historic England, for example, it completely says their scientific advisors provide advice to archaeological sites, archaeological units, community groups. They're there to kind of go in, help you produce a strategy, etc. And maybe that's a resource that could still be needed. And I think strategies are really important. And I used to work in commercial, and believe me, commercial companies don't really get a lot of this either. You know, so paleo-environmental sampling should be in the WSI, but often what's in the WSI, so the written scheme investigation or the plan going into a dig, is pretty much we are going to take X amount of samples, we're going to take bulk samples, but there's maybe not so much question as to why you're taking those bulk samples, and are you taking samples from all the right places as well. So, you know, have you taken a sample from every post hole? Have you taken a sample from every pit? Have you taken a sample from every ditch fill? Have you taken several samples from a ditch fill? Have you taken amount of sample from a ditch fill? So for example, have you taken 40 litres of material from a ditch fill, or have you taken 2? And then, you know, that's going to really impact on terms of what you're going to get out of it. And you might think something's not very rich, so it's not really worth taking a lot of material out of it. But if it's not very rich, you should be taking a massive sample. If it is very rich, then you should be taking a sample of at least sort of 10 litres. And that's going to make sure that you've got all of the charcoal, all of the plant remains in there. So thinking about it before you go to these sites, think about how it can link into the regional research frameworks that are being written, the national research framework, and just an example here of a table that I did for when I was at Headland, for things like, you know, what kind of feature have you got, what kind of ecofacts and artifacts it might contain, and examples of research questions. You know, was the pit used for refuse disposal? Was it a pit for grain storage? Ditches, was domestic rubbish thrown into the ditch? Is there evidence of recutting, redigging? Grave fills, for example. Any evidence of materials in there. So sometimes even in funeral pyres, we get evidence of nutshell, cereal grains, etc. They're drying kilns. So a lot of this you could sort of tailor and have a kind of dynamic strategy on the site, 'cause things will change. But it's good to get it in there, I think. And think about what the question is. So if you're looking at vegetational change on your site, you know, have you taken pollen samples? Yes, you have at Tarradale. What's the you know, but have you made sure you got it all correct? MPPs and non-palm panels, plant macrofossils, insect, microscopic charcoal, macroscopic charcoal. So, you know, depending on the climate, depending on the question, you can see there's a lot of lots of methodology we can throw at it. And as I was saying before, the more kind of methods you throw at something, then the better the overall picture you're going to get at the end of it. And the key thing really is to have multi-proxy studies. And in a lot of excavations that take place, there are multi-proxy studies. There's a lot of things that are done run of the mill in terms of animal bone, etc. But then there's more things that can be done to that. So it's good to kind of think about it. And I just thought I'd kind of put this on as the last slide to think about potential collaboration. So yes, there is a resource in historic environment Scotland. Of course, there is with Lisa, etc. There isn't the kind of same resource that there is at Historic England, but there are people at different universities like myself who would happily get involved. I think so. You know, it's worth kind of knowing where people are. So Pollen, there's a lot of palynologists still in Scotland. It's a leading place for palynologists. So there's people at Aberdeen, St Andrews, Stirling, for example. Wood and charcoal, University of High Science. Insects, beetles now at University of Glasgow, and of course flies at Edinburgh, etc. So there are people out there, and maybe it's worth having a look at this. I remember that SCARF did put a directory up, but I had a look on the SCARF website and it seems to have disappeared. So maybe it's died a death again. But anyway, that's just food for thought, because sometimes it takes a long time for things to come together on these projects, but it is worth maybe keeping an eye on who's around and who can help. And that's me, I think.
Thanks.